Hello, pilgrims and wanderers through the desert. This is day 53 of the Bible in a year, and we're going through the desert wanderings, and we are looking at Numbers chapter 2 and Deuteronomy chapter 2. I'd like to kind of go back a little bit, though. Again, we're seeing as Father Michael Schmitz said, there's good news and bad news, and the book of Numbers is what we're going to be reading first every day for the next few days. And through the book of Numbers, that's kind of the more interesting book. And then Deuteronomy will be read secondly as the kind of non-narrative book that doesn't have as many narrative stories and such. It's a little more boring. But as Father Michael Schmitz says, good news and bad news. Today and yesterday was kind of like we had... First, we heard the beginning of the book of Numbers, which was boring, all those numbers. And so today and yesterday, first we're hearing from the interesting book that has a boring beginning, the book of Numbers, because it's going to get more interesting. And then every day we'll be hearing from the book of Deuteronomy, which is the boring book, which has an interesting beginning. So yesterday and today we had kind of interesting reading from the first and second chapters of the book of Deuteronomy, which is Moses kind of recapping and giving a summary of all the adventures that they'd had in the wilderness journeys, which is basically what the book of Numbers is all about. So we're getting a little preview of the book of Numbers in the first chapter of Deuteronomy, the first two chapters of Deuteronomy. But again, the book of Numbers, as we get into that, it is a kind of an interesting book in the sense that it mirrors the book of Exodus in certain ways, as I mentioned yesterday. And both books kind of emphasize Sinai, and Sinai is at the center for both of those books. And it's kind of structured, both of them, so that there's rebellion on either side of Mount Sinai in both books. And also there's kind of a pattern that you see in both the book of Numbers and the book of Exodus, and it is this. First, the people kind of murmur and they complain, they rebel against Moses, they strive or struggle against the Lord, and then Moses kind of pleads, or Moses discovers that he needs help, and he tells God, I can't bear these people alone, and I need help. And then the next kind of step in the pattern is that God gives miraculous help, or provides God's provision for the people, and he gives some sort of miracle or some sort of aid or help for Moses. You may remember that yesterday in the first chapter of Numbers, there was the repetition of a certain phrase, and I'd like to comment on it, and that is you kept hearing that each of the tribes, 12 times it repeated that each family or tribe was listed counting the number of names or men 20 years old and upward, every man able to go forth to war. Able to go forth to war. It just keeps repeating, times 12. You get that phrase repeated. And this is what it's kind of all about. Actually, censuses were done to count, how many soldiers. In fact, it's kind of called a census of the soldiers. It's a soldier census to see how many people we have, men at arms. How many do we have? And so it goes to show you that this book is a book about the fact that they're going toward the promised land, and they have to defend themselves against those who might not agree that God wanted them to have this land, the promised land. And so it's a symbol, though, for us of the spiritual battle of life. And we're not fighting against flesh and blood, as St. Paul says, but we're fighting against demons and evil spirits and against sin in our lives. And so we can't be cowardly. And so this is kind of a spiritual interpretation that we should have for the book of Numbers. I can remember doing a Bible study about the book of Numbers when I was a young priest with a group of parishioners in another parish, and it was fascinating to think about these spiritual meanings of the book, and also I found a lot of inspiration for me as a priest, because it also says here that the Levites were not numbered. So one of the 12 tribes was not numbered, the tribe of Levi, and they were not counted because they're not going to be soldiers. They were in charge of just being near the tabernacle and doing the spiritual work of the Lord. And so that kind of meant that they weren't going to be drafted into any kind of military service. It says that in verse 47 and 48 and 49 of the book of Numbers, the first chapter. It also says there in verse 46, it mentions the whole number. After you counted up all these tribes that were counted, it says the whole number was 603,550 persons or men at arms. And so this was a huge number. And some scholars, though, say that there could be it could be that this is not an exact number because of the Hebrew word Eleph. There's a Hebrew word Eleph, which some have interpreted to mean 1,000. But it could be that instead of, because it's also a word that can mean a designated group of people, such as a family tribe or a squad of military people. So maybe it wasn't, as it says here, 46,000, but it could mean 46 squads, or not 46,000, but 46 groupings. And so instead of 46,500, it really meant 46 squads totaling 500. In other words, 46 squads of 500. And so that would give a lower number. And that would mean that the total men of Israel who were going through the desert were actually only 5,550. And that, with their families and wives and children, it would be closer to 20,000. And that makes more sense because scholars and archaeologists say that the entire population of Canaan, the Holy Land at that time, as they were coming in, was only 1 million. And if the Israelites were 2 million, it would have been not a problem to go, marching in. But they were probably a smaller number, and so this interpretation is probably correct, that it was a smaller number. It wasn't really 2 million Israelites. I think there's something very interesting in chapter 2 of the book of Numbers that says that those on the east side of the encampment were the ones who had the sort of a priority, a place of honor. Judah was the first. Whenever they broke camp, the ones on the east side would go first. Judah, which means praise, as Father Michael Schmitz points out, goes first, and that's in our lives too. Praise goes first. And then the other tribes that were on that side, and then the priests, and then the other tribes. But this fact that the east side was first kind of goes. The reason why it has priority is because entering the tabernacle tent of meeting was always from the east side, and so this is significant for the Mass. In Catholic churches, we're always oriented toward the east. That's what the word orient means. Ad orientem means that the altar would face the east, and the priest and the people would be facing east toward the presence of God. And so this was kind of significant, and here it is in the Old Testament as well. I'll just point out one thing about the book of Deuteronomy chapter 2, and that is that in verse number 14, there's something interesting. As Father Michael Schmitz mentioned, it does kind of offhand remark. Moses says that we're out there in the desert for 38 years. But it goes on. It says, until the entire generation, that is, the men of war, had perished. So because these younger ones, the ones that were old enough, in that first year, they were afraid, and they did not go up and conquer the land or enter the promised land. They were afraid to do that. They were therefore condemned to wander for 38 years. And only the younger ones we're able to enter. And so that, again, kind of shows this theme of courage. A big theme in this book is courage, that we have to not be afraid if the Lord tells us to go up and do something or even to take risks. We have to have that courage.